Okay, this session is about the Spanish Civil War. It's entitled Spanish Civil War Varieties of Historical Investigation and Experience. My name's Dave Chappell. I'm an activist in the Communication Workers Union and a local postman. And I'll just say a few words about our speaker, who's a veteran, certainly. Certainly, I should imagine one of the oldest veterans of the anarcho-syndicalist movement here today. So, Brian Bamford was born in Rochdale in 1940. His political involvement was with the Young Liberals. He then became involved in direct action in the CND in the late 50s, and in 1960 was involved in a pretty important apprentices strike which started in Glasgow and was a bit of a wildcat that spread south and obtained increases in pay and better conditions for engineering apprentices at that time. And not long after that apprentices strike, through political contacts made on the picket line, Brian joined his first anarcho-syndicalist organisation, the Syndicalist Workers' Federation. In 1962 he served a few days jail in Strangeways for direct action against nuclear missiles, and his involvement at that time was in the Northwest Committee, the Direct Action Committee, the Committee of 100. Brian Bamford has worked in Spain, lived and worked in Spain on no less than 3 occasions. 2 of those were under somewhat clandestine conditions of Franco's Spain. For a couple of years, 1963, 1964, he was a member of the Federation of the Young Libertarians of Liberia, Spain, working as an electrician. Back again in Spain in 1967, working as an electrician in Gibraltar, and a member of the TGWU, and the last time in Spain was in 1986 to 87, where Brian was a member of the CNT. Since the 1980s, Brian's been involved in trade union activity, both before and after his working life as an electrician. He was instigator of a very important support group for sacked electricians in 2003, which and some of you, hopefully most of you, will have read about this, that in the last couple of years even the government has admitted a secret blacklist of working electricians who are union militants, and Brian Bamford was one of the key people who forced the government, if not to stop the blacklisting, at least to admit for the first time ever that that existed. And Brian's also Secretary of the Tameside Trades Union Council. Brian's going to talk for about half an hour, then hopefully we can have a discussion about Spain, and he's going to concentrate on the way that the Spanish Civil War has been portrayed in the media, and particularly in writing. Professor Paul Preston, for example, at the moment an English professor, has, I believe, one of the best-selling books in Spain. It's called The Spanish Holocaust. It was published in Spanish before it's published in English. It's not even published in English yet, and that book is about the mass graves, particularly of Franco's side, but also some killings that took part on the Republican side. So that's what Brian's going to concentrate on. But obviously the subject is the Spanish Civil War. Brian's pamphlet, which he's compiled on the Spanish Civil War, is here. Brian Bamford.
A couple of years ago, some daft doubts were shed absurdly on an observation George Orwell makes in the first chapter of his book, Homage to Catalonia. In that book, he says of the December crowds in December 1936 on the Ramblers in Barcelona during the Spanish Civil War, in which he writes, "Except for a small number of women and foreigners, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes or blue overalls or some variant of militia uniform. The impression from Orwell is that even on their paseos, parading on the Ramblers, Catalans dressed down all the time, like perpetual plebs. Today, recent analysis of film footage of Durruti's funeral, which took place in Barcelona in November 1936, the month before of Orwell's observation, shows clearly among the 500,000 mourners, people present at that event, where many mourners were in shirts, ties, and even sombreros and suits. On the back of this evidence, some pundits, like Jim Young, Secretary of the International Brigade Memorial Trust, have claimed that if Orwell got this detail wrong about the manner of dress, might he not have got much more wrong in his account of the Spanish Civil War? Furthermore, a modern historian of the Spanish Civil War, Professor Paul Preston of the University of London, in 2009 declared of homage to Catalonia, quote, "I would rank homage to Catalonia alongside Spike Milligan's Adolf Hitler, My Part in His Downfall." Another interesting book by someone who was a foot soldier playing a tiny part in a much wider conflict. Now, Professor Preston does not say that Homage to Catalonia is a bad book. Indeed not. Preston says it is a good book, but the problem for Professor Preston is that it is the only book that most people now read on the Spanish Civil War. A good book, but one that too many people read. What is the problem then? The problem is that the Spanish War was a wider conflict than Orwell could have experienced in the 6 or 7 months he was in Spain, between December 1936 and the middle of 1937, when Orwell finally had to escape with his wife and friends over the French-Spanish border into France from Catalonia. Now, one of my own problems and frustrations when in 1963 I was involved with the Young Libertarians of the FIGAL and living with my wife in the Mediterranean fishing village of Denia in the province of Alicante, was that I felt I really didn't know what was going on in the rest of Spain. To find out what was happening in the Asturias, where in the 1960s the miners were regularly in conflict and on strike, I had to read the Times of England a day or so late. Ultimately, I took a rather fruitless trip to the Asturias, hitchhiking my way up in the middle of 1963 to try to learn more of what was happening. And I even got myself detained by the civil guard when my money ran out in the province of Segovia when I was on the way back for failing to carry documentation, for failing to carry my passport with me because I left it with my wife in Denia. It's not, of course, entirely true that I knew nought about what was happening while I was in Spain. It was just that most of the time I never seemed to be in the right place where the action was happening, because I was still, in a sense, living my life through the headlines. In fact, that only happened once in the 1980s when I was working in Gibraltar at Gibraltar, when the SAS shot the IRA terrorists on Winston Churchill Avenue. But though I didn't know intimately and in depth what was happening with the miners in the Asturias, what I did know was the less dramatic aspects of everyday life in the town of Denia, on the Cabo San Antonio. My boss, Juan Paris, used to say to me, "Brian, you might not know the whole of Spain, but you know the Cabo San Antonio muy bien." The importance of this mundane fact is not to be ignored, because what it meant is that I knew what it was like to live on Spanish wages. I experienced life in a small Spanish workshop. I worked alongside Spanish workers. I knew the problems of making ends meet, the cost of living for ordinary Spaniards, the price of bread, which was set centrally at 3 pesetas, 30 centimos. I knew the inside of people's houses because I used to deliver gas butano into the kitchens of the inhabitants of the villages of the Cabo San Antonio. And I knew something of the problems of the Spanish building workers on the coastal construction sites, because I had mates among the Andalusian immigrants from the province of Seville who had come to the coast for work. I was aware of some of the tensions that this caused between the locals and the incomers. I knew about this myself because, as an incomer, there were some insults exchanged in the streets with some local workers. This in turn brought me into contact with the local guardia, the police, and their attitude to foreigners and tourists, and the protective attitude of some of the other locals towards me. And eventually, I knew something about the clinics, the Spanish approach to childbirth, because my eldest lad was born in the clinica in Denia. And I have experienced how Spaniards respond to this. I experienced how Spaniards respond to this. This ongoing richness of everyday life, which we so often overlook. Just as I was in danger of overlooking it by rushing off to the Asturias to check out the miners in the summer of 1963. People like Ludwig Wittgenstein and Harold Garfinkel, in his book Studies in Ethnomethodology, written in the 1960s, have urged that we do ethnographic studies of everyday life, that we look out for the seen but unnoticed features all around us, and that we try to see the ordinary as something that is anthropologically strange. Returning to the problem of ethnography, the problem of knowing what's going on, even when one is geographically close to the events and still inclined to overlook it. A good example of this dilemma is Sir Walter Raleigh. When he was imprisoned in the Tower, he set about writing a history of the world. He finished the first volume and was up to the ancient Greeks, and well stuck into the second volume when there was a scuffle between some workmen outside the window of his cell, and one man was killed. Then, in spite of diligent inquiries by Sir Walter, and in spite of the fact that he had actually seen the thing happen, Sir Walter was never able to discover what the quarrel was about, whereupon it is said that he burned what he had written and abandoned the project. George Orwell said of this story, which may or may not be true, that Sir Walter was probably wrong to throw in the towel on his general history. The thing here is that because Sir Walter couldn't solve the immediate local problem of his ethnographic and empirical research over the killing which took place outside his cell, he abandoned his general history of the world. In Professor Preston's terms, Sir Walter Raleigh gave up his study of the wider conflict, the history of the world, because he couldn't overcome and resolve the local evidence of the fight outside his cell. This fight between the workers being a very small part of the history of humanity. Thus we have a Professor Preston as a grand general historian in one corner, and Sir Walter Raleigh's obsession with local events in the other. The problem for Professor Preston is that because it is a primary source, Homage to Catalonia will remain an important document long after Professor Preston's own history of the Spanish Civil War has been superseded by other historical accounts. It will survive precisely because it is an eyewitness account. The fact is that originally, when it was first published in 1939, Homage to Catalonia had a print order of 1,500 copies. 12 years later, in 1951, the stock was remaindered, and the Anarchist bookshop, Freedom Press, brought up the last of the stock. Today, with all its flaws and the quibbles about the dress sense in Barcelona, it is, as Professor Preston makes clear, often the only book on the Spanish Civil War that people read. And historians, like Professor Preston, deeply resent this. Timothy Garton Ash has describes Homage to Catalonia as a gold standard in war reporting, and its survival is a measure of its success. When we set about producing our Northwest Trades Council booklet on the Spanish Civil War in 2005 and 2006, we quickly clashed by those who had written the narrative on the Spanish Civil War in this country for generations, the former communists in Greater Manchester. In the end, we, that is Tameside TUC, retained control of the booklet. The other side broke away and produced an exhibition to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Spanish Civil War in 2006. Our approach to editing this booklet was to follow an ethnographic anthropological approach and to let the individual contributors speak for themselves. We didn't just pick anarchist accounts. We used selections from people like Ralph Cantor. Ralph Cantor's previously unpublished journal of the Spanish Civil War. Cantor from Cheetham Hill, Manchester, was a member of the Young Communist League, was one of the first Manchester lads to get to Spain in December 1936. His record of events shows the evolution of his understanding of the Spanish Civil War. In just the same way as Ken Loach's film Land and Freedom shows an evolution of an individual involved in a struggle with himself and with his comrades in that war. Yet, of course, Cantor, like Orwell, is just another foot soldier. But it's a valuable account because it captures the spirit and atmosphere of the war better than any academic history could possibly do. We also interviewed Pedro Cuadrado, who in 1936 was a Socialist Republican police officer in Barcelona. And in 2005, when we got round to interviewing, was still living in Bolton. We got a biography of the Communist International Brigade officer, Sam Wilde, by his daughter, Dolores Wilde. And we covered the scope and involvement of other communists like Joe Norman from up north and Howard Andrews from down here. And also the participation of independent people, people with no party, and people not even members of a trade union, such as the nurse Lillian Ermston from Staley Bridge, and the apprentice tailor James Keogh from Ashton-under-Lyne. These accounts are often what we could call members' accounts. What the historian and the sociologist claim to do is to come along and deal with these accounts by members and participants, and to analyse them and interpret them, and to produce an historical or sociological narrative or background according to some chosen academic model, be it Marxist or structural functionalist or whatever the particular bias of that particular scholar happens to be, whether it be Professor Preston or anyone else. Thus, Professor Preston, when he sneers at Spike Milligan and George Orwell for being foot soldiers, only having a tiny understanding of a great war and much wider conflict, is by implication claiming that the economic, by virtue of measuring these different members' accounts, as a privileged and superior knowledge of something like an event like the Spanish Civil War. A superior knowledge of the conflict to those who actually participated in the events and wrote about their experiences as Cantor and Orwell did. I must here declare a doubt and an interest of my own, because I come from an academic tradition, which is called ethnomethodology, which is the study of people's methods, that claims that a sociologist's and a historian's account is just another member's account. And the academic, no academic, has an automatic right to claim superior knowledge to the participants. And just because he has juggled with the evidence, according to some academic cuckoo formula of his own. Now, this is not to say that the general historian, like Professor Preston, deliberations on a topic are worthless. Not at all. I'm just saying we cannot in any way regard them as automatically superior claims to those of the actual participants and the individual involved, such as Orwell.
Thanks, Brian. I might have suspected, knowing my friend Brian, that a polemic was in there somewhere, and you certainly had one. Just a couple of little things from me. Lillian Ermston, who Brian mentions, that's a very, very interesting story. A nurse from Staley Bridge, and Brian and I discovered a few years ago, during the course of the 70th anniversary, that actually a communist lady called Winifred Bates had been to Spain, and she toured all the hospitals, the military hospitals run in the Republican zone, And basically what Winifred Bates did, and this was in the Moscow archives, was have a moral audit of all the nurses. And her verdict on Lillian Ermston was that Lillian Ermston had basically shagged her way around the Republican Army. And on that perceived basis, which no doubt was inaccurate, the Communist Party made sure that Lillian, even though she wasn't a member of the Communist Party, was sent home in disgrace. Because she was perceived to have had love affairs with more than one Spanish Republican. And Howard Andrews, who I got to know just before he died at age 101, who was also a male nursing assistant. Now, he was a loyal communist, but and this ties in with what Brian was saying about oral testimony and the value of it, because although he remained a loyal communist, and in fact, he still called in 2005, when I first met him, he was 98, and he said, does the Daily Worker still come out? And I said, no, it's a rag called the Morning Star. And he went and joined the Communist Party again on his 99th birthday. I couldn't talk him out of it. And we had the General Secretary come down. But one of the best bits in Howard Andrews' testimony, and Brian knows this, was he was working under one of the communist doctors called Tudor Hart in Teruel, high up in the mountains. And this must have been a key point in the Spanish Civil War, when the Spanish Republican effort was becoming increasingly under the influence of Moscow, and they were kind of disciplining everything and turning it around. And one of the things they did was to restore rank. And you know, I've got this on tape, and Howard said, well, up to then we'd all mucked in. You know, we ate and slept and did 24-hour shifts, whether it was Tudor Hart or us or the Spanish helpers and the cleaners. We all mucked in, and all of a sudden Tudor Hart appeared in the hospital courtyard with two strangers in army military uniform, and Howard just walked past him with a pail of shit or whatever he was doing, because he was an orderly, and he didn't salute, and because he didn't salute, he got a week in the glass house, and that was pointed out by this communist Tudor Hart, that things had changed, that uniform was coming in, the rank was coming in, that differential pay was coming in, and whether he was a loyal communist or not, he was going to jail. So a couple of little stories to add. Okay, so you've heard Brian's talk, and you know, the subject is there, how the Spanish Civil War has been written about. But obviously, the main subject is the Spanish Civil War, so we've got plenty of time for chats and discussion. So take Roger first, and then comrade there. Roger.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting what you're talking about, because you know, this sort of that disparity between oral history and, you know, and how it's understood. Because one of the big criticisms of oral history is, you know, certainly up to about the 1980s or 90s, was that you know, is how do you study whether it's objective or not? You know, it's like, so it was originally seen oral history as you take oral history and then you maybe interview, you know, 5 people, and if they kind of all say the same thing, then it's true. You know, it's a kind of objective history. So if you interview 5 people and they all said, oh yeah, on April the 1st, you know, we did this, we assaulted this place, and there was this battle, and that becomes real. But I think what's much more interesting is you know, I'm certainly not a postmodernist, but one of the things that came out of oral history was that what was important wasn't just this idea of objective facts, but the idea of what people desired at the time. And that, you know, I'll give you a very quick example. There's a lot of work done in Italy, I don't know, in the 1980s, where they're interviewing old communist militants, you know, from the 1920s, 30s, 40s. And they found this story kept appearing in Italy. These old guys are dying off, and then, you know, interviewing them about the Second World War and the Italian partisans and how they overthrew the Nazis and Mussolini. But they all around Italy, you get this same story, and the communist militants would say, well, it was 1945, you know, we all had the guns, we'd overthrown Mussolini, you know, we'd kicked the Nazis out, and we were ready for revolution. And, you know, so we're all waiting for the Communist Party to come down and say, here we go then, we're going to take over here now, because we've got the guns, we've got the people, you know, we've risen up anyway. And, you know, and they're all waiting, you know, and the story came out everywhere, and they said, oh yeah, well, I've got a communist militant would say, oh, the secretary of the Communist Party turned up, and, you know, said, is it time for revolution? And he'd kind of say, no, we've got to go for democracy and all this, you know. And he'd say, oh, I argued with the secretary of the Communist Party. And they interviewed loads of people over Italy, and they found that actually the secretary of the Communist Party needed to be in about 200 places for this to happen. So, you know, with all history, you just sweep that away. If it's objective, oh, they're all lying, they all made it up. But why were they all saying the same thing? Why did the same story, even if it was a myth, come out? It's because actually everybody wanted revolution. And what they were doing was like, you know, giving a sort of dream about it, and they argued with the Communist Party, all these communist militants. So I think the interesting thing with Spain is like, it's not the objective stuff, you know, that Professor Preston might laugh about, you know, like, oh, these guys, you know, they all said this stuff didn't really happen, you know, it didn't really happen on that day, and, you know, it's kind of, they're all memories of fog. But the point is that what were they, and I think that's a bit what Homish Catalonia is about. It may have been what maybe George Orwell desired, but if you had that story from hundreds of Barcelona anarchists or workers, and they said, you know, they talked about that time in that way, then it doesn't matter if it wasn't actually true, because it actually is what they desired, and that's important as well, not just what happened, but what people desired at the time.
I was going to pretty much recant that story, but yeah, probably wouldn't have done it so well. But it was good also. So I wondered, it's kind of a bit off topic, but I don't know about the term, was it ethnographic approach to that? I wonder if you could talk a bit about that approach and what it involves. Because I've kind of heard the word before, but didn't really know what it meant.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, you know, what you said about oral history, you know, I think that is what it is. It means going in, you know, in an anthropological way and asking people what went on. I mean, I think Chomsky said that what was lacking was there were a lot of people involved in the Spanish Civil War, and they hadn't, you know, rank and file people that, you know, their accounts had not been documented. I mean, in Cantor's case, yeah, I mean, he's obviously wrestling with himself to try to find, you know, writing his diary, which he don't know it's going to be published. He's just keeping a record of what his mates are saying in the trenches. Their attitude to the officers, you know whether they think it's a Fred Carnot circus that's going, you know, this is all coming out. Now, there's no real reason to believe what he's, you know, that he's not writing it for propaganda, but he's writing it for himself. You know, so this gives it some credibility. You know, I take on board what you were saying about objectivity and subjectivity. You know, yes, it is subjective, but we understand why it is subjective. I mean, the critical thing is that what the historians sometimes pretend to do, and Preston doesn't always do this, is they pretend to be objective when they're, you know, so you don't know where they really stand. But in Preston's case, I think in that book, The Spanish Civil War, it becomes out quite clear what his bias is in the preface to the more recent edition of the Spanish Civil War that he wrote. It's clear that he's against the anarchists and so forth. So in a sense, you can say, well, yeah, all right, but this is a bias. You know, you know where the bias is coming from. You don't always know where because they pose as being objective, but they're just playing around with accounts, really. And what the ethnographic approach is to go in and ask people, you know, what their feelings are, and to document those feelings at the grassroots. If you see what I mean, it's more anthropological than historical. You see what, if that helps, I don't know.
Anybody else? Yeah, at the back.
Have you got an opinion on Anthony Beevor's account of the...
Yeah, I'm quite impressed by Beaver. I don't know. You see, I understand from Stuart Christie that he spent some time. I gather, was it written in '86 originally?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think he spent some time in Orkney with Stuart Christie. I mean, so we know there's a little possible bit of bias in that, but he's a military. The thing with Beaver, what's interesting about Beaver is that he's a military historian originally, and a lot of what he says in that book is to do with the nature. He's questioning why they fought certain battles and not other battles. And he argues, I won't say he seems to argue, because he does argue that some of those battles were fought for propaganda reasons rather than for military strategic reasons. That's my understanding of what's critical in some of what Weber's writing, and he knows about the military aspect.
Chap in front, you had a hand up? Yeah, sorry, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I wonder if we're in danger of being seduced in a way by the fact that Orwell, we're focusing on Orwell here, a great literary figure of the 20th century. So we have the trust we place in him is unimpeachable. But if it was someone we didn't, if there were lots of first-person accounts of people who don't know, how are we to know whether they're well motivated or not, or whether they are manufactured? Reports of Germans being attacked in real Poland. You know, those were first-person accounts coming out of Silesia. But they, in retrospect, they were very badly motivated, they were concocted. They might look, but they might be indistinguishable at the time from well-motivated reports coming out of Spain. I'm just wondering if you're trying to elevate the idea of the first-person account. It's only with retrospect and that you can decide you can distinguish the two, isn't it? Well, unless you have a trustworthy figure.
I think with Orwell, I think the fact that it survived, you know, the book has survived, gives it some credibility in itself. But I mean, it doesn't. First-person accounts are not sacred, are they? You know, I mean, we've still got to use critical judgment with them. Well, all I'm saying is that this claim of Preston, that the historian knows uber alles, he knows above all better than the participants. We can't just swallow that. You know, that's what I'm saying. We cannot swallow just because he's an academic and he's looked at different points. We think of a situation like a strike or something like that. So what does the sociologist do? He comes along and he considers the point of view of the actual striker, and the point of view of the trade union official, and the point of view of the foreman, and the point of view of the boss. And because he's considered all these points of view, that makes him automatically superior to any of the other points of view. All I'm saying is that it's just another member's account, which is the sociologist's account, according to his own particular bias. As long as we know what the bias is, the important thing is to know where the bias is coming from, But I'm not saying, obviously not saying that all primary accounts are sacred,
As far as I'm concerned, I've not read Homage to Catalonia. I've read Laurie Lee's account of the lead up to the war. It's nearing prose, but it's the sort of work and struggles, and it's a more personal account of things. I've not read A Moment to War, but I've read an awful lot of things. I mean, Professor Preston, was that Paul Preston?
Yep. Paul Preston.
Okay, I've read that book. I've also, out of all the things I've read on the Spanish Civil War, I've seen documentary-wise and film-wise, the most interesting thing was a documentary done by the BBC ages ago, and I managed to rob it online somewhere. And the most interesting thing about it is you get interviews of villagers who are phalange, like fascist, ultra right-wing, all the way to anarchist, and everything in between. And you get historical accounts of their perception. And that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's a history, really. I don't really care about what's decided as a history by whoever. Because it's completely irrelevant. Whether you're talking about a collective account and then decisions based on a collective account, it's meaningless. It's people's experiences that count, and how you determine that, and how you analyse that, either in terms of the anthropology, is meaningless as far as I'm concerned, because it is down to people's experiences, and that's this documentary is the perfect example, because it had a range of accounts from all walks of life, and that was the most interesting thing I read.
Before I bring you in, I mean, if I may say just quickly, the struggle in England to get at the truth of the Spanish Civil War is obviously a lot different. It's a few thousand miles away from in Spain. But what Brian didn't have the time to explain was that although basically the communist tradition in this country is dead, it's still alive in the battle on how the Spanish Civil War should be remembered. So, for example, what Brian and his colleagues achieved in Manchester, not without a lot of pain and personal attacks and a split, from what started as a well-intentioned Greater Manchester Trade Union Council pamphlet on the 75th anniversary of the Spanish Civil War, got into a very, very bitter battle in which this pamphlet was only produced, and Brian and his comrades deliberately produced this, and it's mostly the oral personal testimonies of international brigaders, which, if you like, goes halfway. But what was wanted was a commemoration which was just purely based on the record of the international brigades. Why? Because 99% of the international brigaders were filtered through the Communist Party before they even got to Spain. So the testimony of other people who may or may not have contacted other anarchists. So what I'm trying to say is this battle, I'm afraid, is still very much relevant in England today in 2011. So, for example, there is an organisation called the International Brigade Memorial Trust, and its latest edition, which only came out last week, Brian and I were talking about it, talks about, thank goodness that the Republicans restored order after the anarchists threatened. You know, that's still going on in 2011. And so those battles are unfortunately still going on in this country, as well as the whole thing about the Spanish Holocaust and the relevance of personal testimony.
I mean, no one would deny the importance of oral histories, as you've been saying, and Roger was saying. However, you know, I think back, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, right, and I was a person in that historical period, and I would have my own memories and my own account of it, right? But it's only subsequently, looking at kind of histories of that period, that I've understood my position in that period, and that the things that I thought about that period, I understood them at a deeper level. Why I thought that, why I did that, because of the social forces that were at work in that period. So it seems to me that there has to be a role for somebody, not to say that it's a superior and inferior views, nobody likes that hierarchy, do they? But there's a different and a possibly deeper understanding that you could have from an overview, particularly if you're writing history.
And there's also stuff which is hardly ever put in print, such as the Southmead riots, yeah, which Roger has done some research on, which are probably only ever available, you know, by talking to participants anyway, however cagey they may be 20 years on, and that's important as well.
But I think if you know, to fully understand the period, just to rely on the accounts of the individuals would not be enough for me. You know, I want to know what was the economic basis, what was the political, what was the cultural environment. And then you get the fuller understanding.
But what you heard today was the genius of a polemicist, and that's his style. Yeah.
I'm kind of slightly worried that there's a bit of an anti-sort of theory sort of element that's going on in terms of the argument in favour of the importance of oral tradition. You know, you just gave the example of this, you know, kind of still quite bitter discussion. I mean, I see that as quite a good thing, because, you know, it's really good that I think it's a good thing in the sense that there's a reflection of the Civil War was a bitter fight within the revolutionary movement, and unfortunately the forces of reaction, you know, political anti-working class elements that, you know, the Stalinists represented won out, and I think that, you know, that struggle's, you know, continuing today. So surely isn't that a good thing that we're still having those discussions, and it's quite bitter in the sense it matters to people. That it's important what lessons we learn from that period of history. I mean, I'm just thinking of an example of when I was kind of particularly politically active during the 80s, and I was involved in the anti-apartheid movement. And I remember that at that time the Communist Party still had quite a lot of influence in terms of kind of like popular movements. And they used to argue, as soon as we started talking about like, the strategies of working class, black working class people in South Africa, they used to say, oh, you know, you can't have an opinion about that because you don't come from South Africa. You can't have a view, you can't participate in that kind of discussion about, you know, what are the political perspectives for revolution in South Africa.
Before you come back on, anybody else want to chip in on, you know, rather than just bounce it backwards and forwards? No.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can't. I have to agree with you. You know what you're saying, basically. I mean, my trouble is what was Chomsky's problem in objectivity and liberal scholarship when he got with it in the 60s? He said that Gabriel Jackson was a good historian, but he said that there's this elitist bias, what Chomsky called this elitist bias of the liberal historians, including the communists, that they have this superiority. And Chomsky talks about the gaps in our knowledge, and the gaps in our knowledge are often the oral history or the ethnographic account, you know, which are dismissed or overlooked, and that's when he says I'm a polemicist. That I'm arguing for that position. That's not to say that we should totally ignore and dismiss, as I made clear, the general historian. It's just that we shouldn't give it the elevated status which Professor Preston and others seem to claim for themselves. Yeah.
Okay. I've got a question, Brian, if you don't mind, which is it's about Durruti, because you know, reading a lot of the communist accounts of the Spanish Civil War, Durruti gets quite a good write-up as like a brave fighter, but it seems to me that he gets a good press in some of the communist accounts of the Spanish Civil War just because they say that towards the end of his life, before he was killed, you know, he got stuck into the idea that you had to have a fully modern, rational, you know, Republican army on the same basis as the Francoists, and an end to all the militias. And because of that, he gets into the pantheon and gets seen as some kind of good anarchist. That's just a take on what I've read about the communist history, and I just wondered if Brian or anybody else could put me right on that, or whether, you know, that's just something I found. That they divided like good anarchists who kind of went into the Republican army effort and fought and died there, and others that stayed with the militias on the Aragon front and never wanted that kind of central nationalised discipline. But just something I...
Well,
just take this lad here, take this lad here and then you come back.
I was trying to make point coming back to oral accounts. I think there's a tendency for news reporters or any historians, as they sort of let become, I think, any historical account to go for a line of trying to be balanced. And there's that word balance that people aim for often. I think that's just another ideological point of view that's kind of not, sort of a fake one really to say trying to be balanced. Yeah.
Okay, Roger?
Yeah, I mean, I've been doing a bit of history the last few years, and I can't say I've, sort of been doing it for a long time. But one of the things I find really frustrating doing history in the academy is that there's this kind of view in the academy, and I think it's exactly, I think it's a personal thing. I think it's what you're picking up on, Brian. There's this kind of view of like neutrality, right? So the idea is that the academy is neutral, right? And then there's all these difficult and problematic people who are like, biased, or, right or left wing bias, particularly left wing bias, I'd say at the moment. And so it's kind of like we're the historians and you're kind of a bit rubbish because we're objective and you're not. But the interesting thing is that this neutrality is very odd because it's like, for example, I mean, I don't want to go into the history too much, but something like the 1831 riots in Bristol, which are written about historically, it's very difficult to write about them because you can't, one, all the people who are involved in them are dead. Two, most of the people involved in the riots, half of them probably couldn't read and write, and they certainly didn't write down why they were doing it, and it would have been an oral tradition. People knew why they did it, and they clearly had selectivity, and they went and destroyed these targets, the clergy, the prisons, or whatever. So it was all there, it's all physically there in front of your eyes, all the targets that were destroyed by the crowd. But what you don't know is all the ins and outs of what was going on and what people thought, and and there's a riot. I believe, a couple of weeks ago. I'm sure none of you were there. But like, you know, so it's a similar situation. You know, I mean, if you read the primary sources for the historians of the riot that happened 2 weeks ago, it would be the Evening Post and, you know, with the radio. And you might pick up a series of stories. You might pick up, you know, the fact that, you know, there was a mad petrol bomber. You might pick up the fact, I think today, that there were 15 anarchists from Sheffield who organised it. Sorry, that's the BBC. That's the police saying that today. You might pick up the story that the People's Republic of Stokes-Croft, an evil Moriarty-like organisation that has organised the whole area into a kind of fight club. But, you know, but they're the primary sources. They are the primary sources, right? That's what you would pick up in the future and you would look back at, right? And you know, there might be some really pioneering lefties who got, you know, left-wing stories or bias who would, you know, maybe pick up on some social media or something. But we don't know what really happened because, you know, unless you were there, unless you involved in it, and it's very complex and people still get ideas, you're not going to know that. 1831 is extremely hard to write about. But writing about, for example, you know, British diplomatic affairs in 1830 would be much easier because there's all these primary sources and stuff. So there's a fundamental problem with evidence to start with. So this idea of neutrality is basically based on, there's a class relation for starters. You know, in this neutrality, there's a class relation. It's like, you know, who's writing the stuff and who's publishing it and where's it going? And then there's the people who aren't writing the stuff, aren't publishing the stuff, and it's not going anywhere. It just stays in our, you know, in our social behaviour. So you're already biased to begin with because you're biased against, you know, the classes that have access to the means of production. So there's a massive class bias in this neutrality. So I don't buy neutrality. I don't buy this objective neutrality whatsoever. You know, if you want to talk about neutrality, you start with, you know, let's go back to really basic Marxist stuff and say, what's the material relations that allow people to produce history, produce knowledge and stuff like that? That's where you start. If you really want to talk about neutrality, that's where you start. You look at the playing field. What's the playing field like? Anyway, shut up, but I think that's the point.
And another, you know, another aspect surely that's of interest here is the whole thing about the Mau Mau that's come out in the last month, which I hope some of you found absolutely fantastic. And just one senior civil servant in London wanted to go to that house in the countryside and found not just the Mau Mau records, but the probable existence of probably atrocities committed by British troops in every single colony that may or may not be still in the basement of that house. I mean, that's amazing. Some of you...
That was all the stuff they were trying to destroy, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it actually involved a British officer being present while somebody was being burnt alive, for example.
And was that 1950?
That's 1950s, yeah, 1958, 1957. The British officer was present while a Mau detainee was being burnt alive. Not sure what information they got out of him as a result of that. You know, there's a chap called, bring you in, is Udham Singh. Now, Udham Singh was a young Sikh lad at the time of the Amritsar massacre in 1919. But when the British say they machine gunned 434 people to death, the Indian historians reckon it's more like 4,500. But Udham Singh, 21 years later, assassinated General Dyer's commanding officer, General O'Dwyer, in Caxton Hall in London, in the Second World War. And you try and get the records of that. You try and Google Udham Singh, and most of the records, they're there, but they're filed away for like 500,000 years, and nobody's ever going to see them. It was actually just a sensational act of political assassination, fully conscious. The guy resigned from the Southampton Communist Party about a month before he did the assassination. It's just an example of somewhere the records. Anyway, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I haven't read that much about the Spanish Civil War, but I have read some things suggesting that Russia and Stalin were quite keen that the Republicans lost and that they were trying to give some support to the Republicans for international political meetings, but not enough that they would actually win this thing. About trying to balance the fair petrol at the time and things. Is that in any way true, or is that just something
I think that's true. Brian can have the last word. Anybody else? Because it's nearly 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
We've had a good session. Right, Brian, do you want
Yeah.
to answer a few questions and
in his essay, looking back on the Spanish Civil War, Orwell tries to deal with that question that you just raised, and but he says, why did Stalin get involved in the first place? You know, but he also says, why did he get involved in such a niggly, you know, penny pinching sort of a way. You know, why didn't he throw everything at it? And he seems to come to the view that Stalin, far from being diabolically clever, was really rather opportunistic and stupid in a sense, that he couldn't make his mind up what he was doing. A bit like Bob Crone, the NSSN at the moment. Vacillation. So with Stalin we had vacillation, but with Hitler and the fascists, they knew what they were doing and they stuck to the strategy throughout. You know, so a sort of weakness in Stalin's. Don't think of him as being all that smart, just opportunistic, and that accounts for his chopping and changing his position. Over the question of Derucci, Beaver says when he died, he had a lot of credibility on all sides, and he claims that the fascists were also claiming that he was going to change sides, because apparently one of his brothers was in the flying. And so also the communists, because you read his obituary in Volunteer for Liberty, that publication of the International Brigade, edited by Ralph Bates, the husband of Winifred Bates. The communists obviously wanted him as well, and they were claiming it, you know, as you said. But how much value we can place on any of those claims? You know, Beaver just says, you know, anybody would have had him at that time when he died, because he has so much credibility. I don't know. Does that deal with
Okay, we've had a good hour. I would like to thank the Bristol Anarchist Bookfair, in particular Roger Ball, for arranging this session, because the price come down a long way. Okay.
Bristol Radical History Group organising this.
Yeah, and the Bristol Radical History Group. Sorry, Roger. Yeah. Okay, so thanks anyway, and in particular Roger for organising that. It's been a good session. This pamphlet is available. You know, I can recommend it. And you know, thanks for coming. Thanks a lot. Thank you very much. One thing about the Orthodox electoral position on Stalin's Spanish supporters, that he didn't want to.
That was good. Enjoyed that. You're going to get in touch then? I don't know what we're going to do when we get in touch, but you know. You are, mate. And certainly so.
The more conservative class of France.
well,
not really. I mean, you know, it's sort of Wales based, isn't it? You know, so, but you know, well, we could do something with my college, couldn't we? Definitely, but you know, it'd be quite nice to get like a Swansea radical history group, so maybe sort of. Well, there's loads. When did you start it?
I got going in 2006.
20 years. Yeah, I mean, it was after the poll tax riot. I went back home and never really did. I just went surfing.
That's actually what I heard. I put that in my account in the diary.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Rod.
Yeah, he said
no, I mean, there's not a lot going on. I mean, there's loads of people around. You know, Ian knows all the characters in Swansea, doesn't he?
Can I tell you a funny little story? About 3 hours.
Be in touch, yeah?
3 hours ago, a guy in fancy dress approached me in the middle of the load of stalls.
Sorry.
He was in some kind of semi-clowns type of get-up, right? And he said, "I got to dress up as a bee tomorrow," and I had this on. He said, "Can I borrow it?" So I said, "Well, turn up to the section on Spain," I said, "and I'll give it to you." But he never turned up.
Have you stopped it?
That's fine.